My name is Grace Stone, and I was 31 the day my father gave my brother $1 million and gave me a sentence. We were standing in a rented hall outside Brindle, Pennsylvania. The whole family had come. My father raised a glass, called my brother Ryder up front, and handed him a check to start his own business. Everyone clapped. Then he turned to me, calm as a closing door, and said, "Go earn your own." I didn't argue. I smiled, thanked him, and sat back down. But what I did with the next 12 months, and what my grandfather did quietly, where none of them could see, is the reason a lawyer would one day slide an envelope across a table and make my father scream like a man losing his mind. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people meet impossible families and quiet women keep their receipts. If a story has ever made you sit up a little straighter, you're in the right place. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Let me take you back into that hall. It smelled faintly of sawdust because half the guests were men from the lumberyard who'd come straight from a shift. The check my father held was real, printed large enough to read from the back row. $1 million. Ryder took it the way he took everything, like it had been waiting for him his whole life. He grinned, kissed our mother's cheek, said something about disruption and vision. People laughed in the right places. My father, Gerald Stone, watched him the way other men watch a sunrise. Then he found me near the dessert table. I want you to understand, he wasn't cruel about it. Cruel would have been easier. He was gentle, almost fatherly when he said the words that closed a door I'd been knocking on for 31 years. Go earn your own. The room didn't gasp. That's the part that stayed with me. They just nodded, like a daughter being told to fend for herself was the natural order of things. My mother smiled into her wine, my aunts touched my arm, and told me how proud they were of Ryder. And, at the far end of the head, sat my grandfather, Walter Stone, 81 years old, the man who'd built the whole lumber business from one truck and a bad knee. When Ryder took the check, the entire room applauded. Walter didn't. He sat with his hands folded, looking at me, and he didn't move them an inch. I noticed. I think he wanted me to. I just didn't understand yet what it meant. Here's the thing. Nobody clapping that night knew about me. None of it surprised me. I'd been reading the room my whole life. In our family, Ryder brought the energy into a space, and I brought the spreadsheets. He was 2 years younger and treated like the firstborn son out of a story. I was the one who did the taxes. I started keeping the family's books at 19, the year my father's bookkeeper quit and nobody else could read a ledger. I caught a vendor double billing us $8,000. I never got a thank you. I just got handed more. By 25, I'd passed my CPA exams and taken a job at a small accounting firm 2 towns over. My family knew the title and never once asked what I did with it. My mother had a way of summing it up that I could never quite shake. She'd said it years before, kindly the way she said most of the worst things. Ryder carries the name. You just have it. I used to think that was wisdom. That night, driving back to my apartment across town, I finally heard it for what it was. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that, because people expect tears here. I made coffee, opened a fresh notebook, and at the top of the first page, I wrote the only thing I was sure of. Start. I didn't know what I was starting. I only knew I was done waiting to be picked. The next morning, I drove out Route 9 to the lumberyard. I told myself I was just dropping off the quarterly numbers. That was a lie I let myself keep. The truth was, I wanted to see my grandfather. Walter was already there when I pulled in, because Walter was always already there. His chipped blue enamel mug sat on the counter, where it had sat since before I was born. He poured me a coffee I didn't ask for and slid it over without a word. I told him about the check. I told him what Dad had said. I expected comfort, maybe an apology on my father's behalf. Walter didn't do either. He looked at me over that old mug and asked one question. So, what's the plan? Not, are you okay? Not, that's not fair. What's the plan? I started to say I didn't have one and stopped because I did. I'd written it down the night before in a word. He listened while I talked it through. This half-formed idea of doing for small shops what I'd always done for free for my family. Clean books, smart money, a way out of the hole. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing I'd carry like a stone in my pocket for the next year. I'm not betting on the loud one. I'm betting on the one who shows up. Outside, the first rain of the day started to tick against the tin roof of the office. He told me to come back the next day. He said he wanted to show me the old books. I didn't know why yet. You have to understand what stone lumber and supply meant in Brindle. My grandfather started it in 1968 with one flatbed truck. By the time I was born, it was the place every contractor, every weekend carpenter, every widow fixing a porch came through. It put half the town's roofs over half the town's heads. My father had run it for 15 years, and he ran it well, but he'd never built it. He'd inherited it. I think that gap lived in him like a splinter he couldn't reach. To prove he was a builder, not just an heir, he bet big. He'd taken out a loan to put up a second warehouse on the edge of town. A fancy expansion he talked about at every dinner. And he'd carved $1 million out of the family's future to crown Ryder the next great stone. People in town already spoke about my brother like he was the heir apparent. I wasn't bitter about being left out of the story. I was something colder and more useful. I was paying attention. One afternoon at the yard, sorting old files for Walter, I came across the loan paperwork for the new warehouse. I read it the way I read everything. Slowly. Twice. My father hadn't just borrowed against the business. He'd borrowed against what he expected to inherit from Walter someday. He was spending money he didn't have yet, on a promise no one had put in writing. I didn't say a word. I just filed it away in the cabinet and in my head. My first real client found me by accident. His name was Tom Vasquez, and he ran a one-man repair shop off Main Street. The kind of place that fixes your lawnmower and your marriage. In the same afternoon, Tom was drowning. He owed 3 vendors, his books were a shoebox, and the bank had stopped returning his calls. A mutual friend mentioned that the stone girl was good with numbers. He called me on a Tuesday, embarrassed, ready to be talked down to. I didn't have money to lend him. I want to be clear about that, because this is where people expect a rich relative to swoop in. There was no rich relative. There was just me and a notebook. So I did the only thing I knew how to do well. I went through every number in that shoebox. I restructured what he owed, found him a small line of credit at a credit union that still believed in handshakes, and renegotiated 2 of his vendor contracts down to something a human could pay. I charged him a modest fee and wrote up a real agreement, signed and dated, so we both knew exactly where we stood. That night, I gave the thing a name. I wrote it across the top of a new file, Stone Ventures. It wasn't a fund. It wasn't anything yet. It was a name and a promise to keep the books clean. 2 weeks later, Tom sent me 2 more men from his street. They came in embarrassed too. They left with a plan. I started to think the thing I'd written down might actually have a shape. While I was rebuilding Tom Vasquez's shoebox, Ryder used a slice of his million to launch his venture in style. He leased an office with exposed brick and a wall of glass. The kind of place that costs more to look successful in than to actually be successful. He hired a friend to design a logo, another friend to run social media, and a third friend nobody could explain. The launch had a bar. My parents came. My mother wore a new dress and told everyone her son was an entrepreneur. My father stood by the window with his arms crossed, proud the way men are proud of things they've purchased. I went because not going would have been a statement, and I wasn't ready to make statements yet. I stood near the back and watched the money move in the wrong direction. At one point, a man Ryder was courting as an investor drifted over to me, mistaking me for staff, and asked a real question about margins. I answered it plainly. He blinked, then asked another and another, and we talked numbers for 10 minutes while Ryder watched from across the room. I saw my brother's smile tighten. He didn't like that the investor was listening to me. He liked it even less when the man shook my hand instead of his on the way out. Ryder found me before I left. "You don't have to lurk at my party doing math," he said, smiling for the room. I told him I wasn't lurking. I told him I was learning. If you've ever watched a family pour everything into the loud one while you quietly built something real, you already know how that smile felt. Stay with me. It gets better and it gets earned. Hit subscribe so the next chapter finds you. The whispers started about a month later. They were soft, which is how the worst ones always are. Word went around the family that Grace was bitter, that I was jealous of my brother's gift, that I'd started some little side thing out of spite to embarrass the family. I knew exactly where it came from. Ryder had a gift for stories, and the one he was telling now was about a sister who couldn't be happy for him. My mother called me. She didn't ask how my work was going. She asked me to please not make things awkward at the next dinner. "Don't embarrass us," she said, like I was the embarrassment in a family handing a grown man $1 million to play office. I didn't fight it. I want to underline that, because fighting it was the trap. If I argued, I'd be the bitter daughter they'd already decided I was. So I stayed quiet, and I kept working, and I let the only argument I trusted make itself. One of my aunts had believed Ryder at first. Then her bakery's books fell apart, and she called me, half hoping I'd say no. I didn't. I fixed her quarter, found her $4,000 she'd been losing to a bad processor, and never mentioned the things she'd said about me. She did the math on her own. The next time the family gathered, she sat by me. People notice who shows up when the lights are on and the cameras are off. I told her the only line I'd allow myself: "You can believe what's loud, or you can read what's written. I'll be over here writing." By midsummer, I had 6 clients, then 8. Stone Ventures stopped being a name on a file and started being a small, stubborn engine. I'd take a struggling shop, clean its books, find it a little through people who trusted my word, and take a fair cut when it worked. Then I'd put my cut back in and do it again. I wasn't getting rich. I was getting real. The work cost me everything else. I'd be at the firm by 7, with my own clients until 10 at night, and asleep before I remembered to eat. I didn't have much of a life outside the ledgers. That was my flaw, if you want one. I carried everything myself and let almost no one close enough to help. It made me good at the work and lonely in the world. Most evenings, I'd swing by the yard with a folder for Walter, even when I didn't need to. He'd started asking me questions that went deeper than a grandfather making conversation. How did I structure the small deals? What happened to a client's debt if a shop folded? Who held the risk and who held the paper? He asked the way a man asks when he's measuring something. One night, rain ticking on the tin roof again, he asked me to write it all down for him, the whole shape of how Stone Ventures worked. I thought he was just curious. I made him a 1-page summary, clean and plain, and didn't think twice about it. I should have asked him why he wanted it. I was too tired and too proud to wonder what my grandfather was building of his own. My father heard I was doing well, and it landed on him like an accusation. He didn't congratulate me. He summoned me. I drove out to the house on a Sunday and found him in his study, the door already half closed. He'd been hearing my name around town attached to other people's money, and he didn't like the company it kept. He came to the point fast. I was not to use the name Stone for my little operation. The name belongs to the business. He said, my business. He framed it as protecting the family. We both knew it was a test. He wanted to see if I'd fold the way I always had, trade the thing I'd built for the privilege of his approval. I thought about every year I'd kept his books for free. I thought about the check he'd handed Ryder. And I gave him the quietest answer I had. You told me to earn my own. I'm earning it. His jaw worked. He told me I'd regret being difficult. I told him I'd already filed the business name properly with the state months ago. That part was true, and it was the part that mattered. He could be angry. He couldn't undo a filing. I left before either of us said something we couldn't take back. Driving home across town, I realized the name had become the whole fight, which meant it had become important, which meant I'd never give it up. He told me to earn my own. He just hadn't expected me to keep the family name while I did it. My brother's millions started to leak by fall. I didn't gloat. I barely had time to notice, until he made me notice. Ryder called me on a Thursday, and for the first time in our lives, he needed something I had. The exposed brick office was bleeding rent. 2 of his friend partners had drifted off. His big investor, the one who'd shaken my hand at the party, had passed. He'd spent like the money would refill itself, and now the bottom of the account was coming up fast. He asked me to look at his books. He asked it like a favor he was granting me. I went. I owed myself that much to see it with my own eyes. The numbers were worse than the whispers. Of the $1 million my father had handed him, maybe a quarter was left, and it was draining weekly. He'd built nothing that earned. He'd built a stage. I told him the truth, plainly, the way I'd told Tom Vasquez the truth. I showed him where the money had gone, and what cutting now could save. Then he asked the real question, the one he'd called for. He wanted me to put Stone Ventures money into his company, to bridge him, to be his investor. I looked at my brother who had $1 million head start, and a quarter of it left, asking the sister who'd started from nothing to plug his hole. I said, no, not cry, just clearly. I don't pour clean money into a story. He didn't tell our parents he'd asked. He let them keep believing the launch was thriving. I let him keep that too. It wasn't my secret to spend. That same season, my grandfather started to slow. It was small at first. He came to the yard later in the morning, left earlier in the afternoon. He'd lose his place mid-sentence, and find it again, with a small frown. One gray day, with the rain coming down steady on that tin roof, I found him sitting in the office with the lights off, the blue mug cold in his hands. He waved me into the other chair. He didn't want help. He wanted to talk. He told me how he'd started the yard, which I'd heard 100 times, but he told it differently this time. He told me about the year he almost lost it, and the men who'd carried him through, and how the thing that scared him most wasn't failing. It was watching what an easy inheritance did to a person. Money you didn't earn, he said, can rot a man from the inside. I've watched it. He didn't say my father's name. He didn't have to. Then he said something that didn't fit the moment, and I almost missed it. I've been getting my papers in order. I asked him what papers. He just smiled, the way he smiled when he knew something I didn't, and changed the subject to the weather. I drove home that night, uneasy. I told myself he was tired, that old men talk about papers and weather. I told myself a lot of comfortable things. What I didn't do was push him. I'll let an 81-year-old man keep his secrets because I loved him and because I had clients waiting. I'd understand the cost of that soon enough. A week later, Walter called me out to the yard for what he said was a business matter. I assumed he wanted his quarterly summary. Instead, when I got there, Tom Vasquez was already standing by the counter, holding a sheet of paper, looking like a man called to witness something. Walter had the blue mug in one hand and a single sheet of paper in the other. He set the paper on the counter between us, in the smell of cut pine and machine oil, and told me to read it. It was a term sheet, A simple one-page agreement, drawn up plain, the way he liked things. Walter Stone wished to invest $40,000 into Stone Ventures, my fund. He'd written it as a real investment, with terms, a return, a signature line. I looked up at him, and for once, I had nothing clever to say. He'd been the first person in my family to believe me. Now he wanted to be the first to back me, and he wanted it on paper, where no one could call it sentiment. Why, Tom? I asked. Because a thing this important, he said, should have a witness. I signed. He signed, his hand slower than it used to be, but steady on the line. Tom signed beneath us both. Walter slid my copy across the counter and kept his own, and he said the line I'd been carrying all year, with something new on the end that changed its weight. I'm not betting on the loud one, I'm betting on the one who shows up. Now it's in writing. I folded that single page and put it in my bag against my chest, like it was worth more than the $40,000. It was. I just didn't know yet how much more, or what that ordinary piece of paper would prove in a room I hadn't walked into yet. Walter's $40,000 didn't change my life. It changed Tom Vasquez's. With real capital behind Stone Ventures, I could finally do more than restructure debt. I gave Tom a proper line to expand. He took on a second bay and hired 2 men who'd been out of work since the mill cut shifts. 2 families had income again because an old man bet on his granddaughter, and a granddaughter kept clean books. That's what the money did. It didn't buy an office with a glass wall. It bought somebody's mortgage payment. I started to see the difference between what Ryder had been given and what I was making. And it wasn't about the size of the check. It was about which direction the money flowed. His ran out. Mine ran on. Around then, a few of the shops that had drifted toward my brother's orbit started drifting toward mine instead. They'd heard there was a Stone in town who answered the phone and read the contracts. The name my father wanted to keep from me was bringing me business. I didn't advertise it. I just kept showing up. One evening, Tom stopped me on my way out and said something I've never forgotten. You know, your brother had $1 million, he said. And you've got more shops than him with 40 grand. I told him it wasn't a race. He laughed and said, everything's a race. You just don't have to tell the other guy you're running. I drove home wondering how my father would take it. The day he finally noticed I wasn't losing. I already knew the answer. Men like my father don't get angry when you fail. They get angry when you don't. The reckoning at the dinner table came in November. My mother hosted the way she did, with the good plates and the bad tension. By then, everyone knew I was doing well, and nobody knew what to do with it. My father chose denial. He called my success luck. Said small shops were a phase. Said real business happened at scale. My mother backed him without quite knowing what she was backing. Ryder stayed quiet, which was its own confession. I didn't argue any of it. I passed the potatoes and let them say their lines. Then my mother, refilling her wine, delivered the old verdict like it still held. Ryder carries the name, she said. You just have it. She didn't even mean it as a knife anymore. She meant it as a fact. Worn smooth from saying I let it sit. Later, when the table cleared, I stepped onto the back porch for air, and she followed me out. For a moment she wasn't performing. She looked at the dark yard and said quietly, I grew up in a house where a girl couldn't put her name on anything. Not the deed, not the account, nothing. It was the closest she'd ever come to seeing me. I waited. I think I was waiting for her to finish the thought, to say, and I won't do that to you. She didn't. She pulled her cardigan tight, said it was getting cold, and went back inside to her son. That was the whole apology I'd ever get, and it ended in the middle of a sentence. I stood out there a while longer in the cold. Then I drove home across town, and I went back to work. While I was building, my father's big bet was starting to wobble, and I was one of the few people who could see it. The second warehouse had gone over budget, the way they always do. Ryder's $1 million was gone, which meant the family had nothing in reserve. And the loan my father had taken sat on a foundation I'd read months earlier in that filing cabinet. He'd borrowed against the inheritance he expected from Walter. He'd spent his father's estate before his father was gone. Now, the bank wanted to see that the foundation was solid. They wanted assurance that the stone holdings would pass to Gerald, clean and whole, the way everyone assumed. So my father went to ask Walter to confirm it, to put the succession in writing, the way men do when the money's already spent. And Walter, my grandfather, said nothing. He didn't refuse. He didn't agree. He just got quiet and tired and changed the subject. And my father came away rattled in a way I'd never seen him. I knew then that my father's whole tower stood on a promise no one had signed. I could have done something with that. I could have warned the bank or whispered to the right ear, or simply waited for it to fall. I didn't. I told myself at the start that I would never take anything from my father. I would only build something he couldn't take from me. There's a difference, and it mattered to me. So I kept my head down and my books clean, and I let his tower stand or fall on its own crooked math. Pause with me a second. I never set out to ruin my father. I set out to outlast him. If that distinction matters to you, comment the word earned. I read everyone. Now, back to the year that turned. I didn't know it was the last good day, or I'd have stayed longer. It was a bright, cold afternoon at the yard. The kind that smells like frost and pine. Walter was having a clear day, sharp as the old days, and we walked the lot together, while he named lumber the way other men name horses. At the end he took me into the office and pressed a key into my hand. The key to the yard office. He closed my fingers over it. When the rain comes through that roof, he said, somebody who keeps good books should be the one to fix it. I laughed and said I wasn't a roofer. He didn't laugh. He looked at me steady and said it again, slower, like he needed me to hear under the words. Somebody who keeps good books should be the one to fix it. I understood he wasn't talking about the roof. I just didn't let myself understand how much he was telling me, because to understand it, I'd have to admit he was running out of clear days. So I put the key on my ring next to my apartment key and my car key, an ordinary key among ordinary keys, and I told him I'd come back Sunday. We stood a while in the cold sunlight. The blue mug sat on the counter where it always sat. He told me he was proud of me, which he'd shown me 100 ways, but said out loud maybe twice in my life. I drove home that evening lighter than I'd been in a year, the key cold against the others in my pocket. Sunday never came the way I planned. By Saturday night, the call started. Walter died in his sleep after a short, sharp illness that took him fast enough to be a mercy and slow enough to say goodbye. My father had, and he walked in confident because he'd convinced himself he knew how this ended. He was the only son. He ran the business. The holdings would pass to him clean and whole, and the bank would exhale, and the tower would hold. He'd staked everything on that math. In the days before the reading, he was almost cheerful, the way a man is cheerful when he thinks the hard part is behind him. He even found room to needle me. We crossed paths at the family house where I'd gone to drop off the last of the funeral paperwork, and he looked at me with something close to pity. After this is settled, he said, maybe you'll stop playing business and go earn your own somewhere else. There it was again, the same sentence he'd handed me in that rented hall a year before. Go earn your own. He said it like a man laying down a winning card. I didn't take the bait. I told him I'd see him at the reading. But driving home that night, I felt the year crystallize into a single point ahead of me in a lawyer's office I'd never seen, where an envelope I didn't know about was waiting in a folder. I didn't expect anything. I want you to believe that, because it's true. I thought I'd get a keepsake, maybe his watch. I had no idea my grandfather had spent his last clear months building me something out of paper and patience. I just knew I'd be in that room, and I knew I'd be the calmest person in it. The night before the reading, I couldn't sleep. So I did what I always do when I can't sleep. I went through my papers. I sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and laid out the year. The first signed agreement with Tom Vasquez, the state filing for Stone Ventures, the growing stack of clients who trusted my word. And at the bottom, the single page that meant the most, the term sheet with 3 signatures on it. Walter's hand, slow but sure on the line. I read it again in the lamplight. $40,000, a witness, a grandfather's bet, in writing. I realized something at that table, and it stayed me for whatever came next. Whatever that lawyer said tomorrow, I'd already won the only thing I'd set out to win. I'd built something real from nothing, with my own 2 hands and clean books. No envelope could give me that, and no envelope could take it. If Walter had left me his watch and nothing else, the watch would have been enough, because the believing came first. I put the papers back in order, the way he taught me, and I went to bed. I wasn't going to that office for an inheritance. I was going to say goodbye to the one person who ever truly saw me. That's what I told myself, and I meant it. I slept a few hours and woke calm. I wore the gray suit I wore for clients, not for funerals. I drove across town to Marion Holt's office under a low, wet sky, the kind that promises rain by noon. I had no idea I was about to need every ounce of the calm I'd packed. Marion Holt's conference room was small and warm, and entirely too quiet. We sat around a long table. My father took the head of it without asking, like he'd already been handed the gavel. My mother sat to his right. Ryder slouched to his left, scrolling his phone, bored or pretending to be. A few aunts and a great uncle filled the other chairs there to witness, there to whisper. Later, I took a seat near the end by the window, where I could see the sky going gray. Marion came in with a leather folder and a manner that gave away nothing. She thanked us for coming. She offered her condolences in a voice that had offered them 1,000 times, and still meant them. Then she opened the folder, and the first thing she said rearranged the room. Walter, she explained, had not left a simple will. Years before, with her help, he'd placed a bulk of his assets into a revocable living trust. On his death, she said, that trust had become irrevocable, and most of his estate would pass under its terms, outside of probate, privately, exactly as he'd arranged. My father's brow folded. This was not the script he'd memorized, a will he could read in advance, anticipate, plan alone around. A trust was a closed door he hadn't known was locked.
"What does that mean for the business?"
he asked, and for the first time his voice had an edge of something underneath the confidence. Marion looked at him, calm as still water. "It means," she said, "we follow Mr. Stone's instructions exactly." Outside, the first rain began to tap the window. I heard it before anyone else did. It sounded like the tin roof at the yard. Marion worked through the smaller bequests first, unhurried, the way you'd diffuse something carefully. There were keepsakes. Walter's tools went to 2 old yardmen by name, a college fund for the youngest grandchildren, a sum set aside for my mother, generous and clean, with no strings, which made her cry in a way I didn't expect and didn't enjoy watching. Ryder got a bequest too, a modest one, Walter's truck, the old flatbed he'd started the business with, and $10,000. I watched my brother's face do math. He'd walked in expecting the trust to refill the account he'd drained, expecting Grandpa to bail out the venture the way Dad had funded it. Instead, he got a 30-year-old truck and a sentence about hard work. He set his phone down. For once, he had nothing to sell. My father sat very still. He was waiting for the only line that mattered to him, the line about the business, the controlling stake in Stone Lumber and Supply that his whole tower leaned on. Marion got to it slowly. Before she read who received it, she read the condition Walter had attached, and the room went so quiet I could hear the rain. The controlling interest, she said, was to pass to the heir who had during Walter's lifetime built a business or a fund of their own, and had it documented in writing with consideration and a witness. She let that sit. Every head in the room did the same arithmetic, and arrived one by one at the same impossible answer. My father's hands flattened on the table. My mother turned and looked at me, and I understood all at once what a single page in my bag had been all along. Marion reached into the folder and drew out an envelope. My name was on the front in Walter's handwriting, the letters a little unsteady, but unmistakably his. She slid it down the length of the table toward me. It traveled past my father, past my mother, past Ryder, and every eye followed it like it was the last lifeboat. "Mr. Stone asked that you open this here," Marion said, "in front of everyone." My father found his voice. "This is absurd," he said. "She kept his books once. That doesn't make her." Marion raised one hand not unkindly, and he stopped because lawyers in their own conference rooms have a quiet authority that even angry men recognize. "Mr. Stone was very specific," she said. "Please, Grace." The envelope sat in front of me. I put my hand on it and felt the year press up through the paper. The rented hall, the notebook, the shoebox, Tom Vasquez's hat in his hands, the blue mug, the rain on the tin roof, the slow steady scratch of an old man's signature on a single page. My father was staring at me with a look I'd never seen on him, somewhere between fury and fear. And he was right to be afraid, though not of me. He was afraid of what his own father had seen and written and signed in a year when my father wasn't paying attention to anything but his own tower. I slid my thumb under the flap. The room held its breath, and so did I, because whatever was inside, it had my grandfather's hand on it, and that meant it was going to be true. Inside the envelope were two things, a letter and a single sheet of trust documentation. I read the official page first, because I'm my grandfather's granddaughter, and I read the terms before I feel the feelings. It confirmed what Marion had begun to say. Under the trust, the controlling interest in Stone Lumber and Supply passed to me, Gray Stone, as the heir who had built and documented a fund of her own during his lifetime. The proof of that condition, the document named specifically, was a one-page term sheet dated the previous spring, signed by Walter Stone, Gray Stone, and one witness. The $40,000 hadn't only been a bet on me. It had been the key he'd cut months in advance to a door he knew I'd one day have to walk through. He'd also named me successor trustee over the business holdings, trusting me to keep the books the way he'd kept them. Then I read the letter, and that's where my composure finally cracked quietly, the way mine always does. It was short. It said he was sorry he wasn't there to see my face. It said he'd watched a man hand $1 million to the loud child and a sentence to the steady one. And he decided that day to do something about it, the only way he trusted, with paper and patience. And it ended with the line he'd been saying to me for a year, finished at last. "I'm not betting on the loud one. I bet on the one who showed up. You earned your name long before anyone gave you a dime. It was always yours, Gracie. I just made it official." I put the letter down and let the tears come. 2 of them, no more, because I was still in a room full of people. Then I looked up, and across the table, my father was already on his feet. My father came apart in front of everyone he'd spent his life performing for. It started low and climbed fast. He said it was a mistake. He said his father had been confused, senile, manipulated. He said I'd cornered a dying old man and tricked a signature out of him. His voice rose until it filled the small room and spilled into the hall, until an assistant cracked the door to check, until my mother put a hand on his sleeve and he shook it off. He swore he would fight it. He'd contest the trust, drag it through every court in the county. Marion let him burn through the worst of it, then spoke in the same level tone she'd used all morning. The trust, she said, had been established years earlier, while Mr. Stone was plainly competent, reviewed and witnessed and documented at every step. Contesting it, she said carefully, would be difficult and costly, and in her experience, these arrangements tend to hold when they're built this well. She didn't say he had no case. Good lawyers never promise the weather. She just made it clear he'd be spending money he no longer had to chase a door that was already locked. That's when the real terror reached his face, because my father wasn't just losing an argument. He was losing the foundation his whole tower stood on. The loan, the warehouse, the inheritance he'd spent before it arrived. All of it had assumed this room would go the other way. And the longer he screamed, the smaller the screaming made him. Until the man who handed out $1 million a year ago looked like exactly what he was. A frightened heir who'd never built a thing, watching the one builder in the family inherit the proof. I stood up, not to shout him down. I've never won anything by being the loudest, and I wasn't about to start in my grandfather's name. I waited until the room was quiet, until even my father ran out of breath and stood there heaving. And then I reached into my bag and took out the single page I'd carried against my chest since spring. I set it on the table, where everyone could see it next to Walter's letter. The term sheet, 3 signatures, a date from months before he died, months before he was anything but sharp. If anyone wants to say my grandfather didn't know what he was doing, I said, here's his hand. Steady last spring. Read it. Nobody moved to read it. They didn't have to. They could see it from where they sat, and they could see my father seeing it. Then I looked at him, my father, who told me to go earn my own in a rented hall in front of everyone we knew. I kept my voice as level as Marion's. You told me to go earn my own, I said. So I did. This is what my own looks like. I didn't gloat. I didn't list his sins. I told the room plainly what would happen next, because someone had to keep the books. As successor trustee, I'd keep Stone Lumber open. I'd make payroll. The men in the yard would keep their jobs. I'd work with the bank, honestly, to restructure the loan my father had built on sand, because putting him out on the street would help no one, and dishonor the man who'd raised us both. And I'd offer Ryder a real position, not a gift, a job with hours and targets that he'd have to actually do. My brother looked up at that, and for once he didn't have a single thing to say. In the quiet after I finished, my mother said the thing that ended it. She wasn't talking to me or to my father, or to anyone really. She was looking at the term sheet on the table, and at the letter beside it, and she said it almost to herself. She carries the name now. A year before she'd told me Ryder carried the name, and I just had it. Now she'd watched her own father-in-law put in writing which child had earned it. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest about that. Because this is the moment a softer story would give me a tearful reconciliation. I didn't get one. My mother saw the truth in that room plainly for the first time. But seeing isn't the same as changing. And she went home that day still married to the man who'd shamed me. Still the mother who'd smiled into her wine. The difference was, she could no longer pretend she didn't know. Ryder sat with the keys to a 30-year-old truck in his hand, and nothing to say, which for my brother was a kind of growing up. My father had gone quiet at last, the dangerous hollow quiet of a man recalculating a life. I didn't savor any of it. There's no joy in watching your family meet the truth too late. I turned to Marion Hall, the only person in that room who'd done her job cleanly all day, and I told her the only thing left worth saying. Let's do this by the book, I said. She'd expected nothing less from a granddaughter of Walter Stone. I gathered the letter and the term sheet, slid them back into the envelope, and stood. My father was still talking lower now, to my mother, to the aunts, to anyone who'd hold his version of the morning. I didn't answer it. You don't have to win an argument you've already settled on paper. I told Marion I'd call her in the morning to begin the work, and I walked out of the conference room into the hall and out the front door, into the weather. The rain had passed while I wasn't looking. The pavement was wet and shining, and the sky had cracked open to a thin, cold light. I got in my car, but I didn't drive home. I drove out Route 9 to the yard. I let myself in with the key Walter had pressed into my hand on his last good day, the one he'd told me to use when the rain came through the roof. I stood inside in the smell of sawdust and cut pine, in the building my grandfather started with one truck in 1968. That now in some real and legal sense I was meant to keep. The blue mug sat on the counter exactly where it always sat, where I'd washed it and set it back the night after the funeral. I picked it up. I turned it in my hands. Then I set it down again in its place. Because some things you don't move. You just keep outside. The last of the rain dripped off the tin roof in a slow, steady rhythm, like a ledger finally balancing. I'd earned my own. He'd seen me do it. The weeks after were not dramatic, and I'm glad. Drama is what got us into this. I took up the work the way I take up all work. Quietly and completely. I kept Stone Lumber open. I made payroll the first Friday and every Friday after. I sat down with the bank and laid the books bare, and we restructured my father's loan into something honest, slower, survivable. I didn't crush him. Crushing him would have cost the town jobs and cost me my grandfather's good name. And neither was for sale. I folded Stone Ventures into the work too. So, the fund kept doing what it had always done, backing the Tom Vasquezes of the county, the shops nobody else would answer the phone for. Ryder took the job I offered. The first month nearly killed his pride. He had to clock in, learn the inventory, answer to his schedule. But somewhere in the second month, he stopped performing and started working. And once or twice, I caught him doing a thing right just to do it right with no one watching. I let myself hope a little. My father never thanked me for saving the loan, and I never asked him to. We speak now in the language of business, which is the only language we ever shared honestly. It's not warmth. It's not nothing. Some families heal. Mine just learned to keep clean books, which in our case was its own kind of peace. There was one conversation left, and I had it on my own terms. I went to the family house, not summoned this time, and I said what I'd come to say to both my parents at once. I told them I wasn't looking for an apology. I'd stopped needing one somewhere around the second signed client. What I needed going forward was simple, and I wasn't going to bend on it. Honest dealing, clean books, to be treated in every room and every deal from now on as exactly what I'd proven myself to be. My mother nodded small and quiet. The cardigan pulled tight again. My father didn't nod, but he didn't argue either. And from him, that was its own kind of signature. I'm not asking you to be sorry, I told them at the door on my way out. I'm asking you to deal with me straight. That's all I ever asked. Then I drove home across town to my own apartment, to my own quiet, to the life I'd built with my own two hands. Here's what that year taught me, and it's the only lesson I'll hand you. A name that's given to you can always be taken back, but a name you earn yourself with your own two hands and a set of clean books is yours for good. And no announcement in any rented hall can ever call it back. That's my story. One announcement that tried to shrink me, and one grandfather who put his faith in writing where no one could argue it away. If anybody ever told you to go earn your own, take it as a dare and not a dismissal, and then go do it. If this reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.